My name is Fiona Macmillan, and you see the title of my presentation here on the screen. I'm going to make an argument that the way in which largely Western intellectual property scholars and commentators have treated what we refer to as traditional cultural expressions has amounted to a new form of in the end, unintentionally probably, has amounted to a new form of post-colonial marginalization of Indigenous peoples, which of course has had negative effects on Indigenous peoples, but also has had negative effects on other marginalized creative communities or communities, and in the end has actually had negative effects on all of us. So that's my argument. Now, in the introductory chapter of their excellent book, Laura Murray, Tina Piper, and Kirsty Robinson are commenting on the reluctance of non-Indigenous intellectual property scholars to reflect on the broader significance of the Indigenous experience of community-based regulation of knowledge and cultural production. And so I've extracted here a little bit of what they wrote. We contend that the respectful impulse to treat Indigenous cultural property laws and practices as sui generis, so meaning in law one of a kind, sui generis, has limited their critical reach and comparative power. We reject the binary view that would presume Western people to be entirely comfortable or hegemonized by IP law, and Indigenous or non-Western people to be alienated from it. The reality is much more complex. Now, in this, as in many things, we might say that non-Indigenous cultural commentators were lagging behind a number of their Indigenous counterparts, and perhaps more importantly, lagging behind cultural communities whose lived experience and practice reflects and articulates the fact of cultural cohabitation and the consequent status of not being, as legal scholars perhaps would like them to be, sui generis. Now, I want to talk about this, as you would have seen from my title, in the context of the Australian band, Yothu Yindi. Yothu Yindi was formed from the merger of two bands. One of those bands was composed of musicians from the Yolngu people from the Arnhem Land in Northern Australia, and the other was a non-Indigenous Australian band called the Swamp Jockeys, very Australian name. The band was active from 1985 until 2013. It enjoyed very significant chart success in Australia. It was inducted into the Australian Recording Industry Association Hall of Fame. And all those reasons are reasons I want to talk about it. But the other thing that's interesting about this band is that it made extensive use of Yolngu songs, instruments, and dance, as well as cultural images of the Yolngu people. And the band blended all those things with the sounds and instruments of mainstream rock music. And I'd just like to play a little bit of a couple of clips for you in order to demonstrate what I mean. So this is from Living in the Mainstream. Nope, did it work? Okay, I've lost one of my clips here, but let me see if I can find it. Okay, and here's another one. This is the one that I meant to play first.
History, and that's Youth Indie. Its own name means mother and child.
it's hard for me not to play all of this because I love these songs. However, they're subject to copyright, of course, so I only want to play a small amount of them. Okay, so what Yothu Yindi were doing, very importantly, in the post-colonial situation, was that they wrote and performed music that reflected precisely on the post-colonial situation of Indigenous Australians, including the necessity and reality of cohabitation with white settler Australians, of which I might say I'm one, although I don't live in Australia anymore. One of their most famous songs, Treaty, the first clip I played was song Treaty from the 1991 Tribal Voice album, reflects upon the bicentenary in 1988 of the invasion or colonization of Australia by British settlers, calling for a treaty between Indigenous peoples and settler Australians. Because this was never recognized, as you may know, as an invasion. This song is a characteristic mix of lyrics in English and in Martha, which is the language of the Yolngu people. And you heard a few of the words before, but you hear, this is from the first verse. I heard it on the radio, I saw it on the television back in 1988, all those talking politicians. Words are easy, words are cheap, much cheaper than our priceless land, but promises can disappear like writing in the sand. And a bit further into the song, they have a lot of gems in this song. The planting of the Union Jack never changed our law at all. Okay, the song that gives its name to the Tribal Voice album, which you also heard a bit of, is all in English, rather than being partly in Martha, but it invokes the spirits of the ancestors and the power that they give to contemporary dreams. All the people in the world are dreaming. Get up, stand up. Some of us cry for rights of survival, saying, come on, stand up for your rights, and then repeatedly urging in the refrain, you better listen to your tribal voice. Okay, now, one could describe Yothu Yindi as using a blend of traditional cultural expressions of the Yolngu people and Western musical tropes. But I think that's a problematic description, or it's at least a description that we might want to investigate a little bit. And here are 3 questions, since I only have 15 minutes, that we might want to think about a bit more. One is, why don't we describe their music as a blend of traditional Yolngu cultural expressions and traditional Western cultural expressions, bearing in mind that rock music, as well as pop music, by the 1990s was extremely well-established musical form. Secondly, in any case, what work is the word traditional, wherever you choose to put it, doing in such formulations? And thirdly, what happens when what are described as traditional cultural expressions are used in explicit and contemporary political speech? Because that is what Yothu Yindi was doing. The Yothu Yindi song that I quote in the title to this presentation, along with many other of their very thoughtful and interesting lyrics, and the use of Yolngu cultural practices, suggests to me this band had reflected extensively on these questions and had some answers. The band members are, after all, experts in the use of community cultural forms as contemporary political speech. They always knew they were living in what we might call, in brackets, the cohabiting mainstream. And this is the first verse of Living in the Mainstream. Reflections in the water we see, black and white living together, sharing dreams of red, black and gold, which refers to the Indigenous flag. Living dream time now is the Yolngu way. The use of what we, by which I mean Western scholars and commentators on IP, the use of what we think as traditional cultural expressions as explicitly political speech about the post-colonial condition of Indigenous peoples transforms those traditional cultural expressions, I suggest, into contemporary rather than traditional forms. And this transposition invokes the tensions between the interests of community in culture and the interests of private intellectual property rights holders. And that tension is the hallmark of most contemporary cultural works. That's the complex reality that Murray, Piper, and Robertson refer to in the quotation with which I opened this presentation. But it's a complex reality not only for Indigenous peoples, not only for other non-Western communities, not only for other marginalised communities, it's a complex reality for all of us. As intellectual property scholars, of which I am one, in most cases not Indigenous peoples, our obsession with this concept of the traditional cultural expression as sui generis, as one of a kind, has resulted in the labelling of the cultural practices of Indigenous peoples as somehow not contemporary, not part of the mainstream, which I suppose we mean, by which we must mean Western, even when we know that the political battles around culture and language are extremely contemporary, and that Indigenous peoples have as much right to be part of the mainstream if they choose to be as anybody else. This obsession with this notion of traditional has been at a very substantial cost to our larger understanding of the relationship between community interests in cultural practices and private interests in intellectual property rights. In fact, Martin Kretschmer mentioned this in the panel discussion before. As Murray, Piper, and Robertson argue, we have failed to learn from Indigenous peoples, casting them and their cultural practices as only traditional, whatever that means, I don't know what it means, and therefore sui generis, and acting as though there's nothing traditional in Western cultural practice. As we know, Indigenous peoples were, their position is particular. They were the victims of sometimes extreme violence and always injustice in the colonial period, and that included the extensive dispossession of their lands and the attempt to suppress or destroy their cultures and identities. Their post-colonial condition is to be peoples without a state and so lacking political self-determination. But that is special, that is particular about Indigenous people, but it's that very condition and their ongoing resistance to cultural suppression that means they must, and they have in many cases, found a way to reconcile their own laws on community management of cultural production with intellectual property rights that may belong to community members as a result of the Western legal regimes under which they often live. Instead of paying attention to the management of this complex relationship by Indigenous peoples, instead of learning from it, we act as though, instead, it's got nothing to do with us. Our lives are not like that. We act as though we in the West have no traditional culture or even any contemporary cultural heritage. We act as though all contemporary cultural production can be effectively mediated through the intellectual property system, although in the panel before we've just heard that it can't, but we like to think that way. We fail to see that systems of cultural property and intellectual property have different ways of measuring value. The question of value was also mentioned just about 10 minutes ago. And that according to this way of understanding the world, the value of contemporary cultural production inside the intellectual property system can only ever be an artifact of the market, measured in terms of the economic value of a property right conferred by law. That's okay, but is that the only value that we give to our culture? What are the results of this failure to learn from the experiences of Indigenous peoples? One particularly important one is that in Western legal systems, we have failed to develop the type of meaningful concept of community rights in cultural property that can resist the creeping privatization of everything in our cultural landscape through intellectual property rights. And the consequences of that failure, the failure to develop a strong idea of community rights in culture that can defend the so-called commons or the public domain, the consequences of that failure might be some of the following: the commodification of much of our culture, a high degree of corporate ownership over vast swathes of the traditional and contemporary intangible cultural heritage of the West, as well as of Indigenous peoples, an inability to challenge dominant narratives in the portrayal of our cultural heritage because the fair dealing and other defences have become so weak, the substantial shortchanging of individual authors by a system that favours those who invest in the production and distribution of cultural works over the interests of those who create them, and the absence of any real legal concept of community-produced cultural works. Perhaps, instead of marginalising Indigenous people yet again by calling their practices only traditional, by describing them as sui generis, that is, by lawyers describing them that way, we might be advised to look much more closely at the accommodation the members of such communities, who all have their own law, the members of such communities have reached in order to balance community rights to culture with individual economic claims to particular parts of that culture by community members. In other words, instead of largely non-Indigenous scholars and commentators telling Indigenous people what to do, perhaps we might listen to them and learn something from them. Thank you very much.
So good evening, everyone. I'm going to take over from where Fiona has left, and I think I was just looking, this is basically the traditional cultural expressions between community and property, and I'm specifically looking at a case from where I come from, Kenya, and see whether we can be able to answer some of these questions that we are seeking to raise. Now the question, as Fiona has just put forward, basically, what is traditional cultural expressions? What is traditional? One of the things that we seem to know is that culture is dynamic. And I think as we're having the discussion before this, I was saying that quite a number of things that have happened, if you're going to go through the 100 years of traditional cultural expressions in Kenya, chances are you'll find that they've evolved quite a bit from what they were 100 years ago. So the question is, why are we seeking to protect these particular traditional cultural expressions? And just as a form of introduction, I'd say that probably if I'm going to take the example of music, what would probably be called traditional, folkloric music, or whatever it is that you'd want to use that particular term, you'd find that for a very long time, there's the element of creativity which most people don't seem to acknowledge. And I'll give you the example of the griots in Senegal. These were basically composers who would compose music for specific functions and that get remunerated for it or recognized. So you'd know that if you wanted music to be played for this particular function, you'd have to go to a specific artist to do that. And that basically happens in quite a number of cultures in my country. So the question is, why do we need to have this particular protection? And I'm going to give you an example. What I'm going to do is to take the two traditional instruments that we have from the western part of Kenya. And one of them is the nyatiti. It's a 7-stringed string instrument. And the orutu, which is basically just has 2 strings. So these instruments have been used within that particular region for a very, very long time. So what happens when the traditional cultural expressions are appropriated? And one of the things that we normally try to find out is it traditionally inspired music, or is it traditional music? So, those are some things that when you sit down and think about it, and probably from the clips I'm going to play, we're going to figure out whether this basically applies. So. So that's basically the 2-stringed instrument called the orutu. Ordinarily, that would be played by very specific musicians. Now, the question is, when you listen to that particular song, is it a traditional cultural expression, or is it inspired by traditional cultural expressions? Because the song, this particular person, he's called Akola, he has actually composed the music. So what he has done is actually used the traditional instrument. So probably he was taught by other people who are older than him how to play this particular instrument. But basically, when people listen to this, they'll tell me this is traditional music. But it is actually contemporary music. It's been composed by somebody. It's the instruments that they're using which are traditional. The next one I'm going to look into is, sorry. This is the nyatiti. It's being played by one of the contemporary artists that we have called Ayub Ogada. So if you are going to go by the first discussion that we had today, if you're listening to this, this is probably inspired by traditional music. And if you were to go by Joe Bennett's presentation today, if we had the musical connotations and everything, and you did a forensic audit with this, and what would actually be a traditional cultural expression, they'd be very similar. But you'll notice that this one has, I mean, this would end up having a bit of a twist. It would be more very similar to the first case that we had, that Joe Bennett had given us. So the question is, would that qualify for traditional cultural expressions? Or is it inspired by traditional cultural expressions? Why am I telling you all this? The main reason is, why are we seeking specific protection to deal with traditional cultural expressions? And the next clip probably might give us a reason why. So this is a Japanese artist who came to Kenya and spent probably a couple of years learning the nyatiti, the same string instrument that Mr. Ayub Ogada was playing, and it's a traditional. The music that she's playing is very similar to what Ayub Ogada was playing, but she's come up with her own composition. When you listen to it, she's singing in Swahili, but she's Japanese, and she's made a career out of this. You know, she has world tours, she does everything, and she plays this particular music. Would we be in a position to stop her from using that particular music? No. So the thing is that why are we seeking to protect this? And I think the main reason why we'd want to be looking at the issues of traditional cultural expressions is more to do with issues of, number one, preservation. Number two, to facilitate access. Number three, probably this is where quite a number of people will be coming from, is the issue of misappropriation by the third parties. So when you talk about preservation, it's basically protection of the cultural products which is enshrined in our constitution. So I'm giving you, this is basically very specific to the Kenyan example. So you find that in terms of preservation, again, we have the copyright law, the traditional knowledge law, which provides for documentation and archiving. And then this is all based there to ensure that we do not lose any works in terms of the nature, due to the initial nature of transmission. So you end up having quite a number of projects. One of the biggest projects we have at the moment is what you call the singing wells, where we have one of the local producers going around different parts of the country to try and capture the music which you're worried that it might disappear. And the interesting thing about this particular music is what is used to inspire or to bring out what we call the genre Afrofusion. So you find quite a number of people will listen to this traditional music, and then they'll come up with their own so-called contemporary compositions. Then in terms of facilitation, if you're looking at the law in terms of facilitation, the Copyright Act basically seeks to facilitate access for people who want to use these traditional cultural expressions. So for you to, if you want to use any of the traditional cultural expressions for commercial purposes, you find that the law allows you to seek authority from the Office of the Attorney General. You pay a certain amount of money, which money is supposed to be used for a cultural fund to be able to, advance the different cultures. So that way you find that the law seeks to facilitate. And that was before we got the Traditional Knowledge Act. They recognized that, yes, there's a community from which these particular works emanate from. How do we facilitate the use? Because we're always looking for something new in terms of music. So what is it that people can do that? We've seen quite a number of artists from the US and other countries coming to Africa to seek inspiration to be able to come up with the new sounds. And then in terms of protection against misappropriation, you have the Traditional Knowledge Act, which was passed about 3 years ago. And the main purpose is basically, the interesting thing about this is that as much as it's a sui generis system, it looks very close to an intellectual property law. So if you look at they have the issues, they recognize the rights of the custodians of these particular works. You have to seek permissions. So it's very much drafted in the very same language as the copyright law. But then again, it provides the framework of access. So it's not an issue of stopping people from using it, but to have a structured way within which people can actually come and use this particular music and use it to bring out, to enhance creativity. After all, creativity builds upon creativity. And then they can also limit the type of access. I'm sure I've got so much more to say about that, but I think in the interest of time, I say thank you. That was just an intro.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm a historian, so I will continue what Fiona and Marisella already started. I think it's necessary that we look a little bit closer to the term and the concept of tradition when we want to discuss the topic of this panel. What I will do is I will give you a short history of this concept, which has the concept changed during the 200 years, I would say. And this talk, what I will say, is based on the book I published by Fisher in 2014. And for the English-speaking scholars here, it will be out next February, finally, by Cornell in an English translation. Bruno Latour, the French anthropologist of modern science, once proclaimed that we have never been modern. He argued that the claim of modernity has always been a claim for a revolution in the understanding of time. Modern meant, since the late 19th century, always a contrast, or even much more a break with the archaic and stable past. The concept tradition was just the backside, the antipode of the concept modern. As we also learned yesterday from the wonderful keynote by Aram Sinreich about music and copyright, the rise of modern copyright was deeply rooted in the history of modern cultures itself. The modern composer, the modern authors, and the modern copyright were the outcome of the rise of modernity itself. Therefore, I will argue today that we have not just never been modern, but that we have furthermore never been traditional. I will show you that the question what a postcolonial critique of copyright and the postcolonial alternative to copyright could be has, first of all, to deal with the history of the concept of tradition in copyright law. I will guide you through a crash course about the discussion about tradition in copyright. I will show you that these discussions are not limited to debates about cultural contents and cultural properties in the global south, but have a longer history dating back to the history of Western cultures too. Since the 18th century, when the modern copyright legislation was developed by the new nation states, the basic assumption that something new does not come from God or one's ancestors, or it's not generated in communities, but it's created by an individual, became important for the fabrication of copyright laws. And this new creative individual was from now on called the author, or in the case of music, the composer. As Lydia Gür has argued, compositions up to 1800 were produced for performance, reflected in the fact that the occasion of the composition and the performance date were listed on the sheet music. After 1800, a shift took place. Several speakers have already mentioned it in musical performance practices, as composers such as Ludwig van Beethoven and Hector Berlioz added more precise instructions to their notations and specified the tempo, the rhythm, and the instrumentations. Early legal handbooks and also the first copyright law about copyright in music, for example in Austria, explicitly mentioned the publishers of anonymous works as the legitimate author. So this is my first chapter. It's about excluding tradition, and this is the quote. I translated it. It's from the Gesetz zum Schutze des Eigentums from 840, and we translated it into English. He, the publisher, first recognized the aesthetic, historic, or ethnographic value of the musical piece in its artistic significance, and has published it with this in mind. Through his own intellectual activity, he has rescued it from hiddenness or forgottenness and truly recreated it for the musical audience, end of quote. Copyright had from its beginning strong ties, as we have already heard, with the score. A huge part of cultural production, the traditional, the oral, and the collective, was excluded from copyright in music. As we have heard yesterday from Aram Sinreich, many composers used the material of traditional folk songs for their compositions. As the concept of modernity became important in the 19th century, notions of the unalterable and eternal became rejected in Western culture. But there was a rebirth of the concept of traditional 100 years later, after the decolonization of the global South in the 1960s and after a renaissance of folklore in the United States at the same time. From its beginning, the separation of the modern and the traditional was biased by European Western assumptions, and these biases in the copyright itself became visible again in the international law discussion since the 1960s, and that's where we still are in. Young decolonized African and Asian states began to question some fundamental assumptions in copyright. And one of these was the exclusion of folklore. In 1963, there was a conference of the International Office of Intellectual Property and the UNESCO in Congo, Brazzaville. It's interesting that at this time, African delegates didn't fundamentally question copyright. Not at all, one must say, but they wanted to enshrine it in Africa. As a first step, they had to explain to the European experts and scholars that they were actually in possession of cultural property too. In the context of Pan-Africanism, the African states discovered folklore as symbol of their cultural heritage. The Indian delegate, we have to remember that India was part of the non-aligned states and was a little bit freer, even raised the argument to leave the international treaties or not to join them if the demands of the global South would not be considered, as for example the inclusion of folklore. Now I quote, the reason to protect folklore efficiently on an international basis would be to add to works protected by copyright on a national basis as well as by international copyright convention, another great and important realm of artistic work generally appreciated and largely distributed in industrialized countries too, end of quote. But despite these efforts in the 1960s, nothing happened on the level of international law. The Stockholm Protocol of the Berne Convention didn't mention folklore. A note in the minutes of the conference was all what remained of the whole discussions about folklore. The basic assumption of copyright, which since the 18th century had distinguished between the individual work of a single creator and collective creations passed down orally through the generations, remained valid until the 1980s. This distinction is of fundamental economic importance. While the music of developing nations was an economic resource that authors could exploit, the creators of traditional music remained without legal protection. Third parties were free to use and exploit it. Now I come to the reinvention of tradition. It was not until the 1980s that the legal discussions again addressed the exclusion of traditional cultural assets from authors' rights. In 1985, a UNESCO and WIPO working group on the intellectual property aspects of folklore protection developed a model provision, that's kind of a model law, as a guide for national laws to protect folklore against illicit exploitation. If folklore had remained an expression of national heritage back in the 1960s, it became now, in the 80s, a vessel for a separate social identity of the global South. The UNESCO WIPO Commission recommended that this protection be enshrined outside of copyright because traditional and modern culture creation employ inherently different concept of time. This is more or less a backup of what Fiona already said with the situation of today. I quote, "Traditional creation of a community are generally much older than the duration of copyright, so that for these reasons alone, a copyright type protection limited to the life of the author and a relatively short period thereafter does not offer to folklore a long enough protection." Well, a new argument, folklore requires greater protection, had been found to leave the old copyright untouched. And it was an argument which was filled with the old biases of the 18th and 19th century. The softening or even dissolution of central copyright distinctions enshrined in music copyright since the 19th century recently observed, if one could argue in international law, is inconceivable without postcolonial discourse on traditional culture and folklore. In the 1990s, ethnomusicology scrutinized its own involvement in the music industry and criticized copyrights as ethnocentric and the integration of folklore into African legislation as nationalistic. However, this general criticism of intellectual ownership of traditional culture did not go unquestioned itself. Michael Brown criticized this criticism as romantic assumptions, and in his 1999 Yearbook for Traditional Music, Martin Scherzinger emphasized that copyright need not to be ethnocentric a priori, but the concept itself contains an inherent ethnocentrism. I quote, "The same kind of thinking separates human beings into non-Western groups on the one hand and Western individuals on the other. It separated their stylist patterns of behavior into non-Western ritual as opposed to Western culture, their creative activity into non-Western craft as opposed to Western art, and their music into non-Western society activity as opposed to Western aesthetic autonomy." End of quote. When in 1998 a new WIPO commission began to negotiate the integration of tradition into the international legal structure of authors' rights, the old concepts from the 19th century were no longer sacrosanct. Old criteria such as the recording of a work in some form, individual authorship, and limited protection periods will likely perhaps be softened or abandoned in a future global legal framework when it will come to an end, all the negotiation. Folklore is now subsumed as a potential source, and this is now the new discourse of innovation and creativity under the concept of traditional knowledge. Timelessness and a lack of author, two attributes that the modern era ascribe to tradition, will perhaps no longer be an obstacle to the inclusion in the legal tradition of copyright. But the old question remains, should tradition be modernized, or should the modern be traditionalized, as Fiona argued? And what would be left of the old copyright if we would start to think outside these binary terms, modern and traditional? And after we acknowledge that we are all hybrids now. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much to Monika, Marisella, and Fiona for your presentations. I think there are several points we could start in the discussion. I mean, this conversation after the presentation is also for you to give space to react on each other's presentations. I think there were one thing where things come together is the community based management of cultural production versus the IP, intellectual property system, and what happens in this, where those come together, where those interface, and how we can manage this. But then there is also the notion of tradition, and how helpful is it, what to call tradition, and what's behind it, and yeah. Maybe, I mean, those I think are the two broad lines I could make out of all your presentations. Should we maybe start with the latter? Because you talked about the concept of tradition, which I think came mostly in your two presentations. Should we?
Yeah. For me, it's really important that we also have tradition. We always had in our historical development, we always had part of tradition. But the concept itself was developed just when the idea that we are modern arose. And it's really interesting that part of our cultural production was more or less excluded, or was perhaps excluded for the IP model of a market society. Part of it, the folklore, was modeled outside of economic exploitation, actually studied by scholars, anthropologists, preserved by museums, and actually named as cultural heritage. And the other part of music, actually, the IP part of music was actually handled in an IP model from the beginning on global market for sheet music, and after that for records and radio music, and so on and so on. So my question is now a little bit, what should we do? Are these parts still aside from each other, or are they just more hybrid now, that or have they never been as apart as we perhaps think? And I would be interested in your positions on that, whether this this idea, we have one part which could be exploited by the international market, and we have the other one which perhaps shouldn't be exploited, where the people have the rights to defend their property rights. What do you think?
Okay, I think you've raised quite a number of interesting issues. It's not. Oh, no, I'm good. But one of the things when you're talking about tradition, and sometimes I find it very difficult to use that particular word tradition, If I take the example of just when we talk about music, you have music and then you have world music. Why would we have those different categories in the first place? So in the same way, when we're looking at all these issues of traditional cultural expressions, I think the initial idea was when you're talking about traditional cultural expressions, they're basically defined as things which expressions which have been handed over from generation to generation. They're basically oral. They do not know who the author is and all those things. But I think from the various studies that we've done, you find that that is not necessarily true. The authors if you look deeply into the community, you'll be able to know whom the author is, especially when it comes to the music. Because you had specific people, not just like in contemporary music, not all of us would like to sing, but most of us basically just sing in the shower so that people don't hear. But you have that creative element. So the thing is that I think at that point in time when we were talking about traditional cultural expressions, we were trying to fix it into the existing notions of intellectual property. So you're looking at it in terms of copyright, because you can even see from the history that Monika has given us in terms of where the discussion started off, especially more so in the 70s with the UNESCO issue. But the thing is that I don't think that is the approach that we need to be looking into. We need to look at these works as creative works on their own merit. So it's not an issue of talking about, yes, it's tradition, and as I said, you'll find something is traditional, but it's traditional in as far up to a particular point in time. And even right now, when you find what it is that's coming out, unfortunately, there are quite a number of clips that I had done, but due to some technical issues, I lost my entire presentation. But I wanted to show you now, the first clip that I showed you would be the closest we have to the traditional, because you'd find that the music that the person was playing you'd find that there are songs which were actually performed by the Luo community. The second one is contemporary to the extent that this person, all he did was use the traditional instrument, but he still, had that traditional tune, so to speak, but that particular work of his would still fall squarely within the protection of intellectual property because he's composed it, it fits into all those requirements of copyright. And then the final one, again, it was outright. You could see that this is she's nicknamed Anyango. This is a name from the western part of Kenya. And she has been able to compose her own music after spending, it was a couple of years in this particular, one of the cities in Kenya called Kisumu, learning this particular instrument. So the question is, would that be traditional music? Yet it has been composed specifically by Anyango from Japan, using the traditional issue. So I think it's pertinent, it's very important that we define what we actually mean and we know exactly what it is that we're seeking to protect.
Well, thank you very much to both of you for these great presentations. So I was thinking during the presentation, so why do I dislike this word traditional so much? Bearing in mind that you both reflected on it. And of course, it's not that I dislike the word traditional at all. Of course, it might have some negative connotations in completely other circumstances, but I started to develop this sense of frustration with it because it's been used to marginalize people. And the reason I say that is because without wanting to get into a long discussion about what cultural creativity is, although it's a very interesting discussion, some of which we had in earlier sessions, culture is traditional. That is what culture is. It's building on things that go before. So this comment, I think that, in some senses that you were making, that we're all both traditional and modern, in a sense this false dichotomy between the traditional and the modern, the traditional and the contemporary is part of the problem that we're dealing with here. And it's also very interesting to think about how power relations between the West and the rest of the world also play out here. Why do we think it's important, for example, in Kenya, to look at these questions? Well, it's also a part of the general disbarment of Kenyan musicians and creators and so forth that makes us think maybe some special protection is necessary. And I don't disagree with that. But I think the problem that we have to face up to here, and I was reflecting, Martin Kretschmer made this really interesting comment about how law's made, and he said it's not made because lawyers start trying to fiddle around inside the rules and find new ways to do things. That's not how you change the system. You change the system because the system is fundamentally unable to reflect who you are. And I think that's true. So the system is changed from the outside generally, even though there are movements inside the system. But I think the other problem that we have with this system of intellectual property and cultural heritage that we're living under now is that law also shapes the way you perceive the world. So you stop being able to think outside the boxes. We've got a system of cultural heritage protection. We have international treaties on intangible cultural heritage, but most lawyers, not other people, but most lawyers find it very hard to think of those things as having an overlap. And part of that reason is what's known as a sort of a system problem in law, which is intellectual property rights are private property rights. And cultural heritage is part of international law. They're not private rights. You can't enforce them as an individual, which I think is correct, but it's also hard to enforce them in any court as a community. So we've got a problem where, in a sense, and perhaps I can refer to one other thing that's also gone before, which is, of course, it's the needs of capital accumulation which has driven this particular system. That's not because authors' rights are driven by capital accumulation, but the imbalance of the copyright system in favor of those who invest money in creation and distribution instead of the creative people who make the music is, in a sense, a reflection of the society that we live in. Okay, so that's the society we live in. So I think that one of the things that we need to do a little bit, and my suggestions are really, we need to start thinking outside the box that the existing legal systems have made for us. Instead of trying to think always inside them, start trying to look outside them and pose the questions, which are really important questions, about cultural creativity and cultural production in a way which is a little bit different.
But in an ideal world, if you want to imagine it, the law could actually help to bring forward the developments in that way. And my question is now, can the copyright law or an organization like WIPO, is it still capable to be the table where these discussions are, or should we, for example, Kenya leave the table in Geneva?
Can I just say to that, and then I'll let Marisella, that, I mean, I don't want to express an opinion on that at the moment, but exactly on whether WIPO, but what I would say is that we need to, my argument would be we need to turn the question right round, and we need to say, if we think the protection of, if we want to call them traditional cultural expressions, are important, why don't we think it's important for all of us? How did we get to a stage where jazz musicians and hip-hop musicians and all the rest are not able to, in a sense, engage in what's a community practice of creativity without stepping on other people's toes? So I think my question would be more, I mean, forum is also constraining. So it's not just the law that constrains, but as we said before, the administrative practices and the forums in which law is made also constrict our thinking. But my own view is not, I mean, I don't know what the ideal world is, but my own view is that we need to rethink this question altogether. We need to think much more about if it matters to protect community forms of cultural creation. And this doesn't mean getting rid of private intellectual property rights, but if it matters to protect them also from privatization, as in the argument that Marisella, then we need to look at the question from an entirely different perspective.
So would you suggest rather to talk about community-managed cultural production instead of traditional? And how would that be helping, for example, in the case of Kenya?
I guess you've just asked the question in a different way. But the question is, I think one of the biggest issues is the privatization of what would be perceived to be community property. And one of the things we need to do is to go back, and not really go back, but to re-examine the existing systems. Like both Fiona and Monika have said, one of the biggest problems we have is actually the existing legal system. And I was saying, like, for instance, in our constitution, the traditional cultural expressions are recognized as such. But the problem is, in terms of the hierarchy of the laws, if you're going to be looking at any pre-existing systems that were there, you find that you have the constitution, you have the written laws, you have the precedents, you have all these other issues, and then somewhere at the bottom, on issues which are not dealt with any other law, you have the customary laws. And you find that in most cases, they're normally applied very selectively. And I think this is something that we've picked up from the post-colonial period, whereby the laws, what would happen is, if you're looking at the history of any of the countries, including Australia, Canada, who were colonized by the British, what they do is come and ask you to discard whatever it is that you had, and then they impose this particular system. And it's very sad when it comes to the IP system, it was applied selectively. So mainly it was the subjects of Her Majesty who it would apply in particular in Kenya. So you'd find that the issues when it comes to the existing systems that they had then slowly disappeared. Then there was this particular vacuum that has been created. So we have this cultural goods, so to speak, the cultural works, and we do not have a very specific system. And then what happens now is that we end up thinking in terms of existing intellectual property systems. As I said, if you look at our Traditional Knowledge Act, it very much mirrors the Copyright Act when you're talking about the rights that are being dealt with. So it's something that we need to rethink. Yes, we have all these systems, but what is it that we can do from what existed? What can we learn from the communities in terms of protecting or in terms of preservation? Because I think for most of them it was an issue of preservation and facilitation. And as I said at the beginning of my presentation, is that you'd find that when it comes to music, the music was specifically, there's a specific system of using the music. So if it is a song that has been composed for, let's say, a wedding, that's basically all that you're going to use that particular song for. So you're not going to go and use it for another party somewhere for something completely different. So there are very specific rules in terms of how you're going to deal with this. And they were given recognition. So they were recognized as the people within that particular community who, if you wanted music composed, you'd go to that particular person. So of course, it was not, we did not have it recorded then, but right now, as time goes by, you find that people are recording it. So you're able to access it. We have various groups who have ended up commercializing that. So you have what you can pinpoint as folkloric music of traditional lullabies, which have been commercialized. But the question is, what are they being used for? So we need to re-examine what systems we had before and see how best, or even for the few vestiges where you still have the strong cultural attachment, so to speak, we can actually learn from them and see how best we can be able to deal with this particular music. Because I don't think it is an issue of keeping it to myself, but it is an issue of being able to disseminate it and probably giving the recognition that is deserved from the people or from the community where it came from.
So as one thing you have also always, you have all talked about was what can we learn from the communities for law in general, like how to deal with community-based cultural management, like what can be community rights to culture?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that one of the, this is exactly the example of how law, and I'm a person from settler Australia, and from therefore the Western legal mainstream, how it constrains your own way of thinking about the world. Because one of the reasons that I wanted to emphasize this line in the Yothu Yindi song, that planting the Union Jack didn't change our law at all, is that one of the other things that happens in the confrontation between Western legal systems and these people that we want to marginalize as somehow traditional or indigenous, or indigenous is correct, but as traditional or in some way non-Western, while forgetting they also live in the Western world. One of the things is that we show actually very little interest in what their laws were on these questions, that communities themselves fought and resist this suppression of their own law. So in a sense, we've got very interested in Australia, for example. We're very interested these days in the indigenous culture, in inverted commas, that is westernized settler Australians are very interested in identifying themselves by indigenous culture. We're much less interested in knowing actually about what are the legal norms of communities, how might you find them out. Of course, there are anthropologists who've worked on this, but this is something that hasn't really penetrated into much legal discourse. In fact, there's another interesting thing I was reflecting while listening to Monika's paper is that this whole trajectory of the use of the word tradition and modern, contemporary, in a kind of sociological and historical, cultural sense, seems to be completely at odds with the trajectory of the law. And one of the interesting questions is, why even in Western society the law develops along a pathway which doesn't seem to respond to many of the debates and concerns, which in fact are happening in other kind of systems, even within Western society. So, but anyway, getting back to the point, I think that the members of Yothu Yindi, really interesting group, because the lead singer is a younger brother of an elder of the clan, and all of their use of community images, dance routines, music, musical styles, reproduction of artistic works was all considered to be in accordance with community law, so it's reported. And yet, I don't know of any Western intellectual property scholar, including myself, who's really asked, well, why? How are they? How did that match up with the private intellectual property rights that the band also had in the extremely successful music that they produced?
I think one of the interesting things, again, that came up from Monika's presentation is the whole issue of the realization that there's actually a value in the traditional cultural expressions, to use that particular term. And you find it's because for a very long time, these works were used within, as I said, communities for specific purposes. But I think the whole question of protection has basically come about because of the commodification or commercialization of these particular works by third parties. So the argument can come either from the communities or the government itself. So you find that the communities would say, this particular music has been used, we have not been compensated. They have not recognized us. So is there a system that we can put in place so that we are able to deal with the issue of commercialization of these particular works? So for quite a number of them, they'll say, it's not that we're refusing. We'd like you to access it. We'd like many people to use that particular music. But the question is, what do we get as the community? And I think, unfortunately, that is very close to what it is that you have under the intellectual property rights system. But before then, when there was not much of an issue of commercialization, that's why prior to that, it wasn't that much of a big deal. But with the whole globalization and access to these particular works, you'll find that you get to hear of some music which basically sounds very similar to, some community in central Kenya. It's being played somewhere in California or something like that. The question is, what happens? So even recently, I think we had one of the artists coming in and they wanted to see if they could be inspired by the local music. They're looking for a new sound. So those are the issues that I think have actually pushed people to sit down and rethink and ask whether or not, because prior to that, nobody was that keen because you already had systems because of the scope and the place where this particular music was used. But now it has gone global. So I think those are some of the issues that we'll be looking into.
Yeah, perhaps I would like to remind too that we perhaps should also look not only as we already said, not only on the international law level or the nation-state law level, but also at other bodies which are really important for our questions. For example, the collecting societies, all these intermediaries which have a long tradition of also racial script or cultural script. I just can tell you a historical example of that. The collecting societies from its beginning on they had classifications and rules how to how you call it, to diffuse the money, and it was really a biased system. It was a system which actually was better for composers with scores, and was really bad for the oral tradition, and it was really good for successful artists. And we have also to acknowledge that this whole copyright system, which the admin, as already mentioned, is a star system. It's actually really good for the holders of copyrights who have many works in their portfolio, or for enterprises with many artists with many works. So my question would be a little bit how to deal with this. What could be a bridge of this local? I can see it. We have a local level of norms and laws, and we can handle that. But how do we handle this global music market with these local notions? And I don't have a solution. I'm a historian, but I would be interested. What could be bridges between these local norms and these global universal norms, because that's what the market wanted. Global norms you can trust, you know how to negotiate, you don't have to negotiate for each case individually, you have just a global contract. And how to handle that between these global contracts and these local practices? What to do?
Well, that's an enormous question. I don't think that I don't think there's anything wrong with this, in a sense, being driven at an international law level, because in the world we live in a sense, there's an argument that whether you want to argue that the nation states are withering away or not, there's an argument that in fact we live in a kind of a global culture as well, and so a degree of common legal principles governing our relationships with the way we use cultural production and cultural creativity, has got a lot going for it. I think that for me is not so much of a problem. I think more the problem is that we've become extremely path dependent on the sort of private property rights nature of intellectual property. But it's not just that, it's also because intellectual property itself is intensified, as we heard in the last panel, it's intensified over time. As Martin Kretschmann was saying, the idea that every composer has to be thinking about copyright law instead of composing music, reflecting because the idea of reflecting basic elements in the culture around you has now become so tied up with legal rights, it should really be a question of concern. So I think, but my real argument is that the whole post-colonial condition is that we want to always see these non-Western ways, as we see it, of making culture. I'm not sure, but as we like to see it, non-Western ways, we want to always see them as other. We're not prepared to see them as part of a kind of a global mainstream way of addressing this really serious question between, and because this is not an inherently anti-copyright position, it's an absolutely reasonable that individuals have some types of rights over things that they produce and contribute to our collective culture. I don't think for me that's not really in dispute here. The real question is how we find this balance and how we as a community can defend a certain line beyond which we say, okay, it's not all right to commodify or privatize. And I think that's and we're so unwilling to look outside this kind of path-dependent capital accumulation-driven model that copyrights become, that my suggestion is really the simplest one, that it's driven us to a position where we've privatized so much of our culture and we have so little sense. It's incredibly impoverishing in a creative sense for Western society to believe that we have no traditional culture and there's not rights in culture that we all should have. That's an incredibly impoverishing cultural idea. And so perhaps it's not a ridiculous idea to look to places where people still believe that, to see other models that we could use.
perhaps just, I think that's also part history can take in this, that we can remind. There were periods, for example, in the late 60s, where nation state in the global south, but also cultural anthropologists, people from the folklore scene in the US, they were thinking about alternative paths, and there were discussions about it, and it's really important that we remind we took that path, but there were alternatives, and it's always, I think it's always really important that we think about alternatives. And for me, sometimes law, it's a problem because you think there are no alternatives. You have a really strong bundle of knowledge, which with the long experience, which gives you a lot of trust for the future, and this is really difficult. How to think in alternatives with this really strong tradition in law.
So law turns out to be a bit like neoliberalism then, you know, there is no alternative. But I think that something that's very interesting though is how it precisely, I said for this reason, it shapes how we think. In Joe's really interesting, fantastic presentation, the first question that he asked us when he asked us to listen to music was, do you think they're copied? Okay, that's not the same question as do you think they sound the same, but it's a question, of course, that the question is shaped by the legal environment in which we live. So when I wasn't sure whether they'd copied, it was because I didn't know whether they came up with the same thing by themselves or... So you've got to... You have this way in which all of this apparatus of law so much shapes the way you think, and it's not easy to step out of that, but my argument is, okay, we actually have got examples where we can see people stepping out of it, so why not use them?
Do you have suggestions, like concrete suggestions for this kind of community rights? And also one thought I also have was that, yes, we can think in our culture, we have also community-based culture and so on, but in the case of, I think, the indigenous communities, there are also like power relations in place that also require some certain type of protection, or it's another dimension, I feel, also that comes into play.
I guess it's one of those situations where we literally have to think without the box. In this particular case, if you're looking at the community rights, so to speak, is how best can we facilitate? I'll still go back to the issue of facilitate, preserve, and then avoid the misappropriation. It might not necessarily be within the existing intellectual property law. You can have very specific laws that safeguard the interests of the community as a whole. So the thing is that I guess for many people, when you talk about the rights, it's always based on an individual. But here, the thing is that we're looking at a collective, because as much as there's one particular person who did it and they were recognized as such, because it's something that has gone on over the years, you'd find that it is the community that is recognized as such, and we need to come up with systems whereby we recognize and use that particular work only for the use that they want us to use it for. So we do not go beyond what I'd put in parentheses, the traditional use of that particular work. And I think one of the issues that we're discussing, and I'm not too sure whether Fiona would agree with me on this one, is the issue of the traditional knowledge commons. Because it offers a system whereby, you know, the work is out there, we get to know which community or who's the custodian of that particular work. And if we need to commercialize it or do whatever it is that we need to do with it, we know whom to go to, and we know they can tell us what it is that they can allow us to do with that particular work. So it's not very prescriptive, but it gives the communities the freedom to get into contractual relationships and decide how best that particular work can be used. And I think that way we avoid the pitfalls of either issues of originality, issues of authorship, issues of time-bound protection. So basically you recognize that they do have this particular works which they're custodians of, and then you let them decide how you're going to engage in terms of using that particular work. That's the closest I can think about.
Thank you, Marisella, for giving me a chance to say something about the commons. Just to say about this, and this is an example of doing what you said and trying to think out of the box, the commons is a highly valorized space, cultural and political space. Given that it's so valorized and we make so much of it, it's really remarkable to think that in terms of cultural production, it's entirely created by intellectual property. So the intellectual property says what's in and out of the commons. It's an absence. The commons is an absence of intellectual property rights at the moment. So my argument would be, if we really believe in this place, the commons, maybe we need some positive rights to defend it that don't just depend on the intellectual property system. So it's not so much that I disagree with what you said, as to say that the commons, having this idea that the place where you resist intellectual property is created by intellectual property, seems to me a little quaint.
When you're talking about the traditional knowledge commons, as much as it's based on the commons idea, it's very specific. So I think it's different from the knowledge commons that you have under intellectual property. So it's very specific to traditional knowledge, just creating that particular space where people can actually access and get into the necessary contractual relationship. So it doesn't work on the assumption that there was an intellectual property. It already recognizes that this is work that is owned by a particular group of people, or rather they're the ones who are holding it, but we are trying to be able to allow for access and at the same time documentation and archiving. So it might not necessarily be issues of positive protection, it could be more of defensive, whereby you have a database and everything to basically guide people so that if you want to use that particular work, you know whom to go and talk to. Yeah.
We have, I think, time for one or two questions. Yeah.
Thank you all very much. My question is about copyright and the digital world now, and especially what's happening in the EU with new digital laws being written and the rest of the world that will follow. Will the digital world, will it give us maybe, does it give us the opportunity to really break down copyright and copyright as something that has become kind of perverted, something so overdeveloped? It's copyright law is too complex, it's totally untransparent, and yeah, in our overdeveloped society, will the digital world and the new laws, how can we break it down and actually get into a system maybe that's better? Do you see this opportunity happening now? Also because the digital world will become one world, one law, and not the geopolitical anymore.
Well, if I can just say about that, so sometimes it's, there are some advantages in getting a bit long in the tooth and having been around for a while. So I can remember in 2000 making a presentation where I talked a lot about commoditization or commodification and corporate ownership of culture, and everyone said, this is 2000, so it's a little while ago, and at a conference in Rotterdam, and everyone said, oh no, but the internet comes and it's going to democratize everything and everything will be okay. And then we know what happened, of course, that precisely because the digital world is a vast space, the role of intermediaries still stayed important. And intermediaries, in fact, found a new way to deal with it, new business models to deal with the various problems that the kind of lack of a complete interface between copyright and digitization had provided. It could be, it might be that the digital, it's hard for me to know. I'm horrified to hear that you think that we're going to get the same version of EU law everywhere in the world. That's really even worse than having it in the EU. So, it could be. It's really hard to predict. What we have to understand is that the interests of capital will use intellectual property rules only for so long as it matters to them. So, despite all the endless assertions about intellectual property being someone's property, being a right, being all those things, that's only because it served the intermediaries industry, by which I mean the commodifiers, production houses. It served them well to this point, but as soon as they find another business model, I guess they'll leave it, and in fact there are some signs of that already, and it'll be left, there'll be people like me still who've been around forever saying, well, actually there is some value in intellectual property rights for individual creators. So I think that we shouldn't assume that the arguments that these rights are so fundamental and essential to the kind of industries that are built up around creative behavior will always sustain copyright. They'll sustain copyright for as long as there's not a better way of generating value of creativity. That's a really depressing thing to say, but I think it perhaps is true.
Yeah, I think I would completely agree. At the beginning, there was this whole discourse about sharing of everything. And here again, I think it's really important to look at not only at the law, but also at all the bodies which negotiate actually the collection of the money and the redistribution of the money. And it's not all regulated by law. Most of it is negotiation, and negotiation is always, it's bargaining power. And I think the term bargaining power is really important in that question. Who has the bargaining power, more or less, sets the rule. And I think we shouldn't talk only about, somebody already said it, about the law, but also about the economy, about the contracts, about the bargaining power in this whole game.
Okay, I think we have to wrap up. On that note, thank you very much, Monika, Fiona, and Marisella, for your contributions.